On the morning of April 3, 2026, the war between the United States and Iran crossed a psychological line. Somewhere over southwestern Iran, during a strike mission tied to Operation Epic Fury, a U.S. Air Force F-15E Strike Eagle, call sign Dude 44, was hit and brought down behind enemy lines. It belonged to the 494th Fighter Squadron, one of the most recognizable F-15E units in the U.S. Air Force, based at RAF Lakenheath in the United Kingdom. The F-15E is not just another fighter. It is a dual-role strike aircraft built to fight day or night, at low altitude, in bad weather, carrying a pilot in front and a weapons systems officer in back, a machine designed for deep attack, speed, and survival. That is exactly why its loss hit so hard. For weeks, Washington had projected overwhelming air dominance. By official U.S. descriptions cited in later reporting, American forces had already flown more than 10,000 combat sorties and struck more than 13,000 targets in Iran since the air campaign began on February 28th. Then, in a single moment, the image of total control cracked. The F-15E went down on the 34th day of the campaign, becoming the first manned U.S. aircraft confirmed lost to Iranian fire in the conflict. AP reported it was the first U.S. combat aircraft shot down by enemy fire in war since 2003. In strategic terms, it was one aircraft. In symbolic terms, it was an earthquake. Exactly what weapon brought the jet down is still one of the most debated details. President Trump later described it as a shoulder-launched heat-seeking missile, even calling it a handheld shoulder missile. Some reporting repeated that account. But public technical confirmation from the Air Force has remained limited, so the cleanest conclusion is this: the jet was engaged by Iranian air defenses and did not come home. In war, sometimes the most explosive detail is not what everyone knows, but what nobody can yet prove beyond doubt. Both airmen ejected alive. That is where the story should have ended. Instead, that is where the nightmare began. The pilot and the WSO landed miles apart in hostile Iranian territory. The pilot, Dude 44 Alpha, came down in one area and was recovered the same day in a daylight rescue that itself was already dangerously unusual. But the second crew member, Dude 44 Bravo, the backseater, the weapons systems officer, fell into a far more brutal fate. According to later accounts from U.S. officials, he was injured, isolated, and forced to evade Iranian forces in the rough mountain terrain of the Zagros region, near Kogaluya and Boyar Ahmad province. While one man was pulled out, the other vanished into the rocks, wounded and hunted. And suddenly, the world was no longer watching a shoot-down, it was watching a manhunt. Iranian messaging quickly turned the downing into a propaganda trophy. The wreckage became political theater. The crash site became evidence that American air power, however vast, however advanced, however heavily defended, could still bleed in Iranian skies. At the same time, Tehran called on people to help capture the missing American. That transformed the second airman's survival into something far bigger than a military problem. If he was captured alive, this would not just be a tactical setback, it would become a global humiliation, a propaganda catastrophe, and a defining image of the war. So the United States did what it has built entire generations of warfighters to do. It came back for its own. What followed was not a routine recovery. It was a combat search and rescue mission on a scale so large, so risky, and so politically explosive that even veteran observers described it in near mythic terms. Trump later called it one of the largest, most complex, and most harrowing combat search and rescue missions ever attempted. Subsequent reporting said the operation stretched beyond 50 hours and ultimately involved 155 aircraft and hundreds of personnel. The air package reportedly included 4 bombers, 64 fighters, 48 refueling tankers, 13 rescue aircraft, and more. A full airborne armada assembled not to strike a capital, not to destroy a nuclear site, but to pull one wounded American out of enemy mountains. That is what makes this story so powerful. Because in modern war, militaries talk endlessly about precision, sensors, stealth, and networks. But in the end, the deepest truth is often much more primitive. How far will you go to bring your people home? The first rescue, the daylight extraction of the pilot, was already dangerous enough to sound like fiction. According to officials cited by Aviation Week, 2 A-10 Warthogs flew the old-school Sandy Roll, the classic combat search and rescue escort mission, where aircraft deliberately draw attention, suppress threats, and shield the rescue force. They led an HC-130J Combat King the Sen and two HH-60W Jolly Green II helicopters carrying pararescue personnel into Iranian airspace. The mission reportedly lasted around 7 hours inside Iran, and one of the A-10s was so badly damaged that it made it back toward friendly territory only before the pilot ejected safely. Two helicopters involved in that first rescue also took Iranian fire, with injuries reported among some of the crew. That was just Phase 1. Phase 2 was worse, because while the first pilot was already out, the WSO was still inside Iran, wounded, hiding, moving, surviving. US officials later said he climbed up a mountainside and hid in a crevice while Iranian forces drew closer. He made contact. CIA assets helped locate him, and then, according to AP and ABC, the rescue effort turned into something much larger: surveillance, deception, diversion, constant monitoring, and a deliberate attempt to mislead Iranian forces about where the trapped airman really was. ABC reported that the CIA helped run a deception campaign, spreading word inside Iran that the American had already been found and was being moved on the ground, in part to throw searchers off the real trail. Think about that for a second. A wounded American officer is hiding in a mountain crack somewhere in Iran. Iranian forces are searching, US aircraft are orbiting overhead, intelligence officers are feeding live information, decision makers in Washington are monitoring the man's position around the clock. And all of it is racing against time, weather, geography, and the closing jaws of an enemy state. That is no longer just a rescue. That is war compressed into one human heartbeat. By the time the second extraction began, the operation had grown into a deep penetration recovery mission with extraordinary risk. Officials said the US used multiple MC-130Js and AH-6 MH-6 Little Birds to establish a forward point inside Iran. Overhead, strike aircraft and drones watched and hit nearby threats. On the ground, US Special Operations Forces moved toward the isolated aviator. But even then, everything kept going wrong in the most warlike way possible. Some aircraft reportedly became bogged down in sand and could not take off. ABC reported that 2 MC-130Js and 4 Little Birds were intentionally destroyed by US forces so they would not fall into Iranian hands after mechanical or extraction problems disrupted the plan. Replacement aircraft had to be brought in to finish the job. That single detail says everything about how extreme this mission became. The United States was not merely rescuing a downed airman. It was improvising under fire, burning its own equipment, shifting platforms, fighting the clock, and betting that the rescue window would not slam shut first. And still they pushed forward. Then came the final turn in the story, the moment that transformed a battlefield disaster into a legend. After roughly 48 hours on the ground, the second crew member was recovered alive. AP, ABC, Air and Space Forces, and other outlets all reported the same central outcome. The missing airman was finally pulled out of Iran, ending a desperate 2-day hunt that had gripped Washington, Tehran, and military observers around the world. Trump celebrated it publicly with the blunt triumph of a wartime headline: "We got him." But beneath the politics, the military significance was plain. The US had just executed one of the most dangerous personnel recovery operations in recent memory, deep inside hostile territory, under active threat, after losing one of its most famous strike fighters. That is why the insane F-15 story exploded, not simply because an American jet was shot down, not simply because Iran scored a symbolic win, not simply because the rescue involved 155 aircraft, deception ops, para-rescue teams, strike cover, special operations aviation, and a 2-day survival drama in enemy mountains, but because the whole episode exposed two truths at once. First, even the most feared air force in the world is still vulnerable. A force can dominate the skies for weeks, destroy thousands of targets, and still lose a frontline aircraft to the unforgiving mathematics of war. Air superiority is not invincibility. It never was. Second, the real power of a military is not only in how hard it hits, but in what it is willing to risk after something goes wrong. This was the US military's oldest creed, written in modern fire: leave no one behind. When the Eagle fell, America did not simply strike back. It reached into the mountains through confusion, through gunfire, through mechanical failure, through political danger, and pulled its people out alive. And that is why this episode will be remembered, because the first half of the story is about vulnerability, but the second half is about will. An F-15E Strike Eagle, one of the most famous warplanes of its generation, was knocked out of the sky over Iran. One airman was recovered fast. The other spent nearly 2 days wounded and hunted in enemy terrain. Then the United States unleashed a rescue effort so massive it looked less like a mission and more like a statement. You can shoot down our jet, but you do not get to keep our people.